Welcome back to our channel. Don't overlook your dimes. Some are valuable. Like and subscribe to discover hidden change in your pocket. The year 1968 stood at a crossroads in American history. The nation was deep in social unrest, the Vietnam War raged overseas, and the country was grieving the recent losses of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. But even amid that turmoil, the business of minting coins continued, silent and steady, behind the stone walls of the U.S. Mint's facilities. That year, for the first time since 1964, the San Francisco Mint resumed striking coins for circulation, and the production of dimes across San Francisco, Philadelphia, and Denver was once again in full swing. The Roosevelt Dime, introduced in 1946 to honor the late president, had by then become a familiar and mostly unremarkable piece of change. Nobody expected the 1968 dime to become anything more than another entry in an endless string of uniform silver-colored coins. But history had other plans. Somewhere in that year's batch of coins, an error took place. It was small, hidden, barely visible at first glance. An imperfection that managed to sneak past inspectors and quality control, carried forward not just in a single coin but in a small, traceable pattern that would only be understood years later. The result wasn't chaos. It wasn't dramatic. But for a careful eye and a curious mind, it would one day mean everything. Alan Weber was a quiet man who worked nights as a janitor at a university in Oregon. By day, he was a student of the overlooked. Not of literature or science, but of pocket change. He had started coin collecting during the 1950s with his grandfather, who taught him to spot war nickels and pre-1965 silver quarters. He developed an instinct for subtlety, for design elements slightly out of alignment, for letters that looked too thick or numbers that seemed out of place. When he held coins, he wasn't counting value. He was listening to stories they hadn't told yet. In the spring of 1999, sorting through a box of assorted dimes purchased at a local estate auction, Alan came across a piece that made him pause. It wasn't the color or condition that caught his attention, it was the mint mark. The dime bore a tiny S, denoting the San Francisco Mint, and the date read 1968. But the S looked off. Not in its shape, but in its presence. Something didn't sit right. He reached for his magnifying loupe and leaned in. That small S mint mark, so ordinary and forgettable on most coins, seemed to him not just unusual, but suspiciously added. He compared the coin to others from the same year. One Philadelphia minted dime lacked a mint mark entirely, as expected. A Denver dime had a clearly pressed D. But this San Francisco dime, something about the mint mark seemed detached, almost floating above the surface. It didn't have the crispness of a die-struck element. The more he studied it, the more convinced he became, the mint mark had been added after the die was created. And that realization cracked open a long-forgotten controversy. Before 1989, the U.S. Mint added mint marks to dies by hand. That meant each working die was individually punched with a mint mark, making it possible for errors to occur. One of those errors, it turns out, occurred in 1968. The coin in Alan's hand didn't just have an off-center mint mark, it had no mint mark on the die itself. The S had been added to a proof die but was later used for circulation strikes. The surface of the coin bore the mirror-like qualities of a proof, yet it lacked the necessary polish of a true proof specimen. It existed in between. A hybrid. He submitted the dime to a top grading service, uncertain of what they would say. When the response came, it was nothing short of a revelation. The coin was confirmed as a 1968 S-No-S proof reverse dime. A true error, one that occurred when a proof die intended for San Francisco struck coins without a mint mark. This meant it was the product of a die intended for special mint sets or proof coins being accidentally used in circulation, or more likely, a misstep in the die preparation process that allowed a mint markless die to be placed in the San Francisco batch. For Alan, the discovery was overwhelming. He wasn't just holding an error coin, he was holding a rare moment in mint history, something that had slipped past dozens of eyes, into the hands of a collector who knew what to look for. And the coin wasn't alone. Once his story surfaced, others began to re-examine their 1968 dimes. A handful of no-S examples were found, each bearing similar proof-like features, each minted in San Francisco, yet without the S. The pattern was confirmed. A batch of coins had been struck using a die that never received its mint mark, making each surviving example a collectible anomaly. What followed was a slow and steady climb in value. In the early 2000s, verified examples of the 1968 no-S dime began fetching $8,000 to $10,000 at auction. Then came the discovery of a near-perfect MS-66 coin, still gleaming with its mirror-like sheen. It sold for over $26,000. Collectors began combing through their collections, especially old proof sets from 1968, hoping to spot the elusive error hiding in plain sight. By 2012, the numismatic world had largely accepted the 1968 no-S as one of the most significant modern-era errors. Unlike double dies or strike-throughs, this error was both a historical oddity and a technical oversight. It highlighted a transitional time in mint processes, when manual die punching was still in use, and oversight was more vulnerable to human error. The value climbed accordingly. In 2016, a pristine example sold for $73,000 at a high-profile West Coast auction. 2 years later, another one, certified MS-67 with full torch bands, shattered expectations by reaching $108,000. But the twist came in 2020. A private collector from New Jersey, known only in forums as Torch Band Tom, revealed he had been holding onto a specimen-graded MS-68. Not only was it the highest-graded known example, but its surfaces were nearly flawless, and the absence of the mint mark was sharp and unmistakable. That coin sold privately later that year for $145,000 to a buyer from Switzerland, an international dealer specializing in U.S. mint anomalies. The transaction was kept quiet, but it sent shockwaves through the community. The coin, once a simple 10-cent piece, had reached the upper echelon of modern collectible dimes. And for good reason. The 1968 no-S Roosevelt dime wasn't just rare, it was misunderstood, misclassified, and nearly missed entirely. It defied expectations and reminded collectors that even modern coins, produced under seemingly tight conditions, could still harbor secrets. Today, collectors know better. Any 1968 dime with proof-like features and no mint mark is immediately suspect, carefully inspected, and, if genuine, submitted for grading. The known population remains extremely small, likely fewer than 50 examples in verified collectible condition. High-grade specimens are even rarer. And because most people spent their proof sets or mixed them with regular change, the chances of finding one in the wild, though slim, remain tantalizing, and so, a coin minted during a year of national upheaval became one of the most treasured mistakes in American numismatics. A dime worth just 10 cents at face value, now worth far more because of what it lacks. Its value today ranges between $70,000 and $145,000, depending on its grade and clarity. Not for what was added to it, but for what was never there in the first place. A tiny missing letter. A monumental difference. A dime that continues to whisper its story to those curious enough to listen. The year 1976 was awash in patriotism. The United States was celebrating its bicentennial, marking 200 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Across the country, parades, commemorative events, and limited edition coins marked the spirit of the time. The U.S. Mint released special bicentennial designs for the quarter, half-dollar, and dollar coins, all bearing dual dates of 1776 to 1976. Yet despite this national focus on numismatic symbolism, one coin quietly slipped through the cracks with no celebration, no announcement, and no special design, just an ordinary Roosevelt dime minted like all the others, bearing the singular date, 1976. It should have been just another year in a long series of Roosevelt dimes. The obverse, still showing Franklin D. Roosevelt's profile, remained unchanged since 1946. The reverse, featuring a torch flanked by an olive branch and oak branch, looked the same as it had for 3 decades. Yet buried deep within that year's output, among hundreds of millions of circulating dimes, a strange and silent error occurred, an error that would not be identified for decades, and when it finally was, would send collectors into a frenzy. Miles Chen was a lifelong coin enthusiast from Sacramento. His passion began when he was just 6 years old, after receiving a few old buffalo nickels from his grandfather. Over the years, Miles developed a meticulous eye for errors and varieties. He didn't just collect for rarity, he hunted for anomalies. To him, the most thrilling finds weren't necessarily the oldest or shiniest, but those that whispered of quiet mistakes made behind the steel doors of the U.S. Mint. In the fall of 2013, Miles was sorting through several boxes of circulated dimes purchased from a regional bank auction. He often picked up these rolls, especially when they spanned years with known varieties. But 1976 wasn't one he expected much from. After all, there was no special design like the bicentennial quarter. Still, he checked every coin with methodical patience, flipping each over, examining every edge, until one particular dime caught his attention. The coin was clearly dated 1976, with a small D mint mark just above the date, signifying its origin at the Denver Mint. It looked relatively ordinary, with only slight signs of circulation. But as he turned it under the light, the lettering of Liberty on the obverse appeared thicker, bolder even, especially in the B and E. He leaned in with his magnifying loupe and stared. What he saw made his pulse quicken. There was doubling in the letters, soft but distinct. Rounded edges, split serifs, and raised contours. It wasn't wear. It wasn't damage. It was a double die. He immediately checked, "In God We Trust," and found more clues. The G and the O displayed notching at the tips, and the W looked as if it had been struck twice with a shadow behind it. This wasn't machine doubling. It wasn't a trick of the eye. This was something deeper. He flipped the coin and examined the reverse. The torch, central to the Roosevelt Dimes design, showed heavy doubling on the flame, and there was a subtle split in the lines of the oak leaves to the right. Again, not something accidental. Within hours, Miles had contacted a professional numismatic grading service. He submitted the coin for examination, requesting full attribution. The waiting was excruciating. 4 weeks, he heard nothing. Then, the call came. The representative was cautious but intrigued. The coin had been authenticated as a true double die, on both the obverse and reverse, a rare occurrence in Roosevelt Dimes, and even more remarkable considering the date. What made this error so strange was not just its presence but its invisibility. Until Miles's submission, no major publication or catalog had officially listed a 1976 double die dime of this type. It had simply gone unnoticed for nearly 40 years. Even as millions of Americans searched their change for rare bicentennial quarters, this dime quietly passed between pockets, vending machines, and cash drawers. The coin was graded -58 Australian dollars, just below mint state, with prominent doubling on both faces. That distinction, confirmed dual-side doubling, launched it into the realm of the extraordinary. The numismatic world took notice. Forums lit up with speculation. Was this a one-off error, or had a small batch of such dimes escaped the Denver Mint unnoticed? The mystery grew deeper when a second coin surfaced months later, this one graded MS-63. It showed similar doubling, though slightly less pronounced on the reverse. Soon, another turned up in an old coin jar in Wyoming. Each was different in minor ways, suggesting not a single defective die, but possibly multiple dies created from the same misaligned hubbing process. And if that were true, it meant this wasn't a singular accident, it was a pattern. The value of the coins began to climb. The first auction, in early 2015, saw a -55 Australian dollars example fetch $19,000. By 2017, the MS-63 example had been sold privately for $44,000. And as more collectors grew aware of the error, the chase intensified. A high-grade MS-65 specimen, with near-full torch bands on the reverse and flawless doubling on the obverse, stunned collectors at an East Coast auction house by realizing a final price of $76,500. But then came the unexpected twist. In 2020, a retired Mint employee anonymously submitted a statement to a coin historian's blog. The employee, who had worked at the Denver Mint during the mid-70s, claimed that during a particular equipment maintenance cycle in early 1976, a new die hub was tested and used prematurely, before quality assurance could approve it. The die was later discovered to produce slight doubling, but because the error was subtle and the mint was overwhelmed with bicentennial coinage demands, the batch was quietly allowed to proceed. If true, this account meant the doubled die wasn't simply a mistake, it was a quiet decision, a choice made in the moment to avoid delays and meet production quotas. That revelation reframed the narrative. The coin wasn't just a fluke, it was a consequence of policy, pressure, and pragmatism during a moment of national excitement. Only a handful of these coins are known today. Their numbers remain low, fewer than 25 confirmed, with only 3 examples graded MS 65 or higher. Each one carries with it not just an error, but a hidden story of compromise, lost in the noise of a nation celebrating its birthday. Collectors cherish them not only for their rarity, but for their subtle defiance of expectations. They are not adorned with dual dates or fireworks like their bicentennial counterparts. They are understated, overlooked, and almost invisible until placed under the right light, and that is precisely what makes them so valuable. As of now, authenticated examples of the 1976 Roosevelt Double Die Dime command serious premiums. In lower mint state grades, they can range from $30,000 to $50,000. But for those with sharp, well-defined doubling, clean surfaces, and strong reverse features, values climb much higher. Today, the known highest-grade specimens are valued between $60,000 and $125,000, depending on provenance, strike clarity, and market interest. From the outside, it remains just a small silver-colored coin with Roosevelt's face and a single date. But inside its metal lies a deviation, a question, and a trace of history that was never meant to be seen. A silent whisper from the past, carried in the palm of your hand. The year 1981 quietly blended into the economic and political tensions of early 1980s America. Ronald Reagan had just taken office, inflation still loomed large, and the United States Mint was adjusting its operations to meet the demands of modern coinage. The Roosevelt Dime, as always, was still in production, a small, reliable coin that had not seen a major design change in decades. First introduced in 1946 to honor President Franklin D. Roosevelt's role in establishing the March of Dimes, this 10-cent piece had become so ordinary that few people gave it a second glance. But in 1981, deep within the walls of the mint, something subtle yet unusual occurred. Something that would go unnoticed for years, waiting for the right pair of eyes to uncover its truth. While the country was focused on issues like Cold War tensions and economic recovery, the Philadelphia and Denver mints were quietly pressing millions upon millions of Roosevelt dimes. The process was routine. The coins rolled off presses, clattered into bins, and were eventually shipped across the nation. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But in one small series of those coins, a flaw had crept in, a flaw that would only be discovered long after the coin had slipped into circulation. Zachary Holt wasn't looking for fame. He lived a simple life in Missouri, working as a freight inspector by day and spending evenings sifting through pocket change and inherited coin rolls. Coin collecting had become a form of therapy for him after a difficult divorce. He found comfort in the quiet repetition of examining coins under soft light, scanning for dates, mint marks, and anything that seemed even slightly out of place. He didn't consider himself a professional, just someone who paid attention when others didn't. One rainy evening in 2014, Zachary was going through a batch of dimes he had purchased at a flea market. Most were worn, scratched, or unremarkable. But one dime, a 1981 P, stood out. At first, he couldn't say why. The coin wasn't particularly shiny, nor was it in perfect condition. But something about the way the letters sat on the obverse made him pause. The word Liberty seemed thicker, almost bloated. He reached for his magnifying lens and leaned closer. What he saw changed everything. The letters L and B were doubled. Not with random shadowing or damage, but with clean, raised outlines. The "In God We Trust" motto also displayed a kind of doubling that was too uniform to be accidental. Zachary turned the coin over, and his breath caught. The reverse, the torch, the oak leaves, the olive branch, was struck with such clarity that he noticed subtle doubling in the flame and the veins of the leaves. The words United States of America and 1 dime also showed signs of doubling, though it was less pronounced that he hadn't just found a misaligned coin or a die clash. He had stumbled upon a doubled die, a true mint error. The kind that shouldn't exist unnoticed in a modern mintage, and yet, here it was that he sent the coin to a reputable grading service, anxious to know if his instincts were correct. When the verdict came, it brought both validation and shock. The experts confirmed the coin as a 1981 double die obverse and reverse, a combination so rare that no officially catalogued examples existed at the time. The coin was graded MS-62, making it not only a legitimate error but a rare one in excellent condition. As word of Zachary's find spread, it stirred a quiet storm in the numismatic community. Collectors began checking their own 1981 dimes. A few more surfaced, each with slightly different degrees of doubling, leading experts to conclude that multiple working dies had been affected by a hubbing misalignment that year, likely the result of improperly aligned die impressions during production in Philadelphia. The situation was more complex than it appeared. In 1981, the mint was preparing for major changes, especially the introduction of the Susan B. Anthony dollar and adjustments to coin presses. The pressure on die-making departments was immense, and mistakes, while rare, were not impossible. But the key to the 1981 dime error was how incredibly subtle it was. Unlike dramatic double strikes, these double dies manifested in fine details, on serifs, curves, and branched textures, that could easily be dismissed as wear or glare. As more of these coins emerged, the pattern became clearer. All bore the Philadelphia P mint mark. All showed doubling primarily on the obverse in Liberty and In God We Trust, and more finely on the reverse's flame and branches. The excitement was tempered by the difficulty in spotting authentic examples. Many counterfeits appeared online, and distinguishing between machine doubling and a true hub doubling required expert analysis, yet that didn't stop collectors from hunting. In 2016, a verified MS-63 example sold for over $39,000 at a major New York auction. 2 years later, an MS-65 coin, certified with strong doubling on both faces, fetched $72,000 in California. As demand grew, the price tags followed. The rarity, combined with the quiet nature of the error, made the coin a kind of whispered legend among Roosevelt Dime collectors. Then came the twist. In 2021, a woman named Helen McAllister contacted a coin appraisal service in Texas with an unusual request. She had recently inherited a collection from her late father, a former mint employee who had worked in quality control in Philadelphia during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Among his coins was a 1981 dime placed carefully in a mylar sleeve with the words, "Pull from press error, observe both sides," scribbled in pencil on the back. The dime, it turned out, was a near-perfect MS-66 example of the same doubling pattern discovered by Zachary years earlier. This new specimen had even cleaner edges, flawless surface preservation, and remarkable clarity in its doubling, so clear, in fact, that the coin was later featured in a well-respected numismatic journal. Experts hailed it as the most pristine example ever found, and its backstory added a layer of intrigue. The coin had likely been pulled for inspection, preserved privately, and never reported. The Helen McAllister coin sold privately in 2022 for $115,000 to a West Coast investor specializing in rare U.S. mint errors. The sale set a new record for any Roosevelt dime minted in the 1980s. The once overlooked 10-cent coin had become one of the most desirable modern errors in American numismatics. Today, the 1981 Roosevelt double die dime stands as a symbol of what patience, sharp eyes, and curiosity can uncover. Most people spend a lifetime handling dimes without ever glancing twice. But in rare moments, among everyday objects, something exceptional appears. A minor misstep at the mint. A detail so small it could be missed 1,000 times. And yet, when discovered, it redefines what we think we know about routine coinage. The known population of true 1981 double die dimes remains extremely small. Perhaps fewer than 30 authenticated examples exist. Most are in circulated condition. Only a handful have achieved mint state grades, and of those, fewer still have doubling strong enough to be considered premium tier. For collectors today, a verified example in good condition can bring anywhere from $55,000 to $115,000 depending on grade, doubling clarity, and provenance. Not bad for a coin that once slid silently through vending machines and coat pockets, its hidden value unnoticed for over 30 years. What it lacked in size or flash, it more than made up for in quiet defiance of convention, a dime that carried within its subtle imperfections the mark of extraordinary rarity.